said, I'm a big Civil War geek. Well, we'll see that in a second. But yeah, so as Matt said, I just want to take a minute to thank all of you for coming. Also, just want to say thank you to my good friend Matt for allowing me to be here today. But today we're going to be talking about the 11th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers in the War of the Rebellion. And I say the War of the Rebellion because a lot of those guys referred to it as that right after the Civil War. So, yeah. Well, so as Matt said, my part/full-time job, I am the battle flag preservationist at the state capitol in Hartford. So my job encompasses, as you can see up there, I take care of all the Civil War period flags that were brought to the Capitol in 1879, and they were brought by the Civil War veterans from the state arsenal. So these are the original flags used in the Civil War, and they're at varying stages of preservation. So we're working through that. So that's what I do for work. I also, in my free time, which isn't much, but in my free time, I am the program director for the New England Civil War Museum and Research Center in Vernon, Connecticut. So, and I've been a reenactor for over 15 years now. I started reenacting with the 11th Connecticut, so that's where my interest in the 11th comes from. So I was part of Company A, and we were a Danbury-based company, but now I'm with the 14th Connecticut Company G recreated. So after the 11th, we decided to part ways. So, all right. Well, enough about me, and we'll get into the history of the 11th. So you probably know a lot of this from your 5th or 8th grade history classes, but we'll set up the war. Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, and the southern part of the country didn't like that too much for varying reasons, mainly slavery. But so many of those states are going to secede in 1860 through 1861. And of course, there is a federal garrison in South Carolina in Charleston Harbor, and they are going to be fired on by a Confederate battery, officially kicking off the war on April 12, 1861. Not long after that, President Abraham Lincoln is going to call for 75,000 volunteers to join the Union Army. So the state of Connecticut, in this time frame of 75,000 volunteers, is going to raise 3 regiments that only have a 3-month enlistment period. So they didn't think the war was going to go on for very long, or at least they thought maybe the regular army would be able to handle it. But they figured that out isn't the case after the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. So we have the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Connecticut Volunteer Infantry Regiments, and they all fight at the First Battle of Bull Run. Again, that doesn't go too well, but a lot of those regiments are made up of pre-war militia groups, or militia groups that were starting to form because the Civil War was on its way. So we have groups like the Norwich City Guard, or my personal favorite, the Hartford Invincibles. And then, of course, the Bridgeport Rifles, just to name a few out of many of groups like that. We have a really good photo. This is the 3rd Connecticut at Camp Douglas down in Washington in 1861. You can see we're wearing somewhat similar uniforms. We'll talk about that in 1 second here. So around this same time frame between May and December, so a pretty big time period, May and December of 1861, we also have 3-year regiments being formed. So they realize the war is going to go on a little bit longer, so they start having guys enlist for longer periods of 3 years. And from this recruitment drive, we're going to have the 1st Connecticut Cavalry, the 1st Light Artillery, 2nd Light Artillery, and then we have a whole slew of infantry regiments. We have the 4th Connecticut Volunteers that turn into the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery. We have the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and the 12th Connecticut Volunteers that all muster in around this time. And when the 11th begins to organize, it's going to be between October and November of 1861. And the original colonel of the regiment who raises the regiment is going to be Colonel Thomas H.C. Kingsbury of Franklin, Connecticut, represent. And then, of course, we have 10 companies that are going to form at the same time. I won't name all the company officers, but I'll name a few that you will hear throughout the presentation. We have the Company C, or the German company commander, Captain William Mogling. He's a German immigrant himself. He's an 1848er, and he commands a company of predominantly German men. If you look at the roster of Connecticut men in the Civil War, it's like all these guys with German last names. So I wouldn't doubt that they're even giving orders in German in the field. But it's just that one company. The rest are all regular nutmeg guys. Another guy we'll talk about is Captain Edwin R. Lee. He's out of Hartford. He was actually a gunsmith before the war, working for either Colt or Sharps, and he raises Company D. And we're also going to talk about Captain John D. Griswold, who at the beginning of the war, he was commanding Company I. Eventually, he will command Company A. So a little bit about Thomas H.C. Kingsbury, because he gets confused with the guy who comes in after him. So Thomas H.C. Kingsbury, he is the son of Jacob Kingsbury. That's a photo or portrait of his father right there. But Thomas is born in New Orleans, Louisiana. But his father is from Connecticut, and the reason he's there is because he has a military post with the 1st United States Infantry down in Louisiana. So Thomas is born down there. And at the behest of his father, later on in his life, he is going to attend West Point in 1828. He is dismissed in 1829, probably not that great of a military student. But Thomas really wants to serve in public office or some facet in that way. So between 1857 and 1866, he's going to run for public office a number of times. But probably because being a veteran in this time period would kind of boost your standing in society, he wanted to serve in the Civil War and raise a regiment. A guy under him, we're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mathewson. We don't really know too much about him, but he's going to be the Lieutenant Colonel. Uh-oh, did I hit something? Oh, I might have been stepping on a cord here. So Mathewson is Lieutenant Colonel, and then under them is my main man, Griffin A. Stedman Jr. I think he has a very fascinating story. He's born on January 6, 1838 to Griffin A. Stedman Sr. and Mary Shields Stedman. Now, the Stedmans are a very affluent family in Hartford. Griffin Stedman Sr. is one of 17 directors of the Aetna Insurance Company that is still around today. And his property value in 1850 was $60,000. So that's a pretty good chunk of change in the 1850s. Griffin Stedman Jr. is going to be a Trinity College graduate. He graduates, or alumni. He graduates in 1859. And he makes some very, like a core group of friends at Trinity. And one of them is a man, Charles Hoadley, who he writes to very frequently during the Civil War. Stedman is going to practice law in Philadelphia after he graduates. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he serves with the Washington Grays, a militia company out of Philadelphia. But not long after that, he's going to accept a commission in the 5th Connecticut Infantry, Company I. They're going to shift some things around. He wants to have his buddy join the 5th, and he also wants to boost in rank. So to do that, he's going to transfer to the 11th Connecticut, and he's going to be their major. So building a regiment. So we have to build the regiment now. So all these companies are mustering in at different times or coming together at different times. So through November, the 11th is going to rendezvous in Hartford. Their Camp Lincoln is like right on the West Hartford line. So they're going to hang out in that area. And they are going to learn how to be soldiers. They're going to do company drill. They're going to do manual of arms, all sorts of that regular soldier stuff. And Charles W. Rouse wrote a really great diary. He wrote everything he did from the time he enlisted to the time he mustered out. And so he talks about on October 15th, 1861, that they commenced camp duties, they drilled for 4 hours, and 4 of the men fainted during these drills. So these guys have to kind of build up how to be soldiers and endure that soldier life. But at the same time, they have friends in the 8th Connecticut Volunteers and the 10th Connecticut Volunteers, and they're all doing this around the same time. The 8th is going to leave Hartford before the 11th, and the 11th is going to escort them down to the steamers where they're going to then go south. And that wharf was about where the Hartford Steam Boiler Company is in Hartford now. It's all built all over now, but that's about where these guys would have left. And then through that same time frame, they're going to start being issued clothing. So what I'm wearing here is kind of the early war uniform of the 11th Connecticut. So they would have had a frock coat or a dress coat, and then they would have had a pair of dark blue trousers, and then of course all the belting, the haversack, the cartridge box, and all those goodies. So through this time frame, it's November, now going into December 1861, and these guys are starting to feel Army life a little bit, and they're not always too happy about it. And so Griffin Stedman, in order to raise the morale, is allowed to give them a whiskey ration. And he wrote this letter in 1863 to his friend Charles Hoadley, but I think it kind of sums up a little bit of a lighthearted part of the 11th experience. So he wrote, "I remember many dismal days in Hartford, but compared to this they were halcyon. On account of the rain and cold, I ordered a ration of whiskey to be given out, but owing to my own carelessness, more was distributed than I intended. The men took it upon an empty stomach, and I need not tell you that I had some work to bring them back to camp. Fortunately, more were boisterous. The liquor affected only their knees, but sadly interfered with the alignment in ranks. Considering the fault my own, I could not be angry with them, and consoled myself with the thought that none would take cold. Such the case, I think my weakening their heads, I strengthened their constitutions. But could you have seen some of them as they endeavored to keep in ranks on our way back to camp, that you would have considered mine a regiment of comic actors. I learned the lesson cheap, for the doctor reports not a single cold from the terrible exposure of those 30 hours. So kind of an interesting and more funny experience that these guys had. I can only imagine is like herding cats, all these guys get back into ranks. So, and none of them were ever brought up on charges for drunkenness on duty or anything like that. So Stedman owned up to it. At the same time, in December 12th, 1861, Colonel Thomas Kingsbury is going to attend a ceremony at Hartford Mayor, now Colonel of the 12th Connecticut, Henry Deming. They're going to go to his house where they are presented with some flags that the 11th is going to carry through the Civil War. It's not this one. We'll see him in the next one. But on December 16th, the 987 men of the 11th Connecticut, they're going to leave Hartford on the steamer City of Hartford, and they're going to proceed to New York City on their way south. In New York City, they're met with great fanfare. They march up Fifth Avenue. The men, the enlisted men, are kept in these warm barracks and they're met with a nice warm meal before they head down to fight the rebels. And the officers are going to dine with local dignitaries. And in this same procession, the Sons of Connecticut in New York are going to present the 11th Connecticut with this flag here. I took this photo about a year ago, so this is what this flag looks like now. This is a Frederick Rice style flag. So Frederick Rice was a guy in Hartford making flags, and this was his design, or his father's design. They were tavern sign makers, and this was the design they used. With the eagle standing on the shield, and then if you unfurl the flag all the way, it says 11th Regiment Con Vols, so 11th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers. And Governor Buckingham is actually going to be at the same ceremony. So these are the flags that they're issued in Hartford. This is the original that we have a reproduction of outside. If you go take a look at that after. So you got a smaller eagle with these embroidered stars. They're not painted, they're embroidered. And then later on in the war, they had their battle honors put on the flag. So we have New Bern, South Mountain, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and the Siege of Suffolk. And then this is the regimental flag, or what remains of the regimental flag, but it would have had a big state seal in the middle of it with an eagle perched on top of it, and you can see the federal shield behind it. And then it would have had the state motto, Qui Transtilet Sustinet on one side, and then it would have said 11th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers on the other. And this is probably how it looked like when it was carried through the war. This is Fran Moyer. He's my predecessor, or one of them. And this is how they carried them. So you can see the staff here. It's even broken here where it was hit by bullets during the Civil War. But you have that second flag, the one they were presented with in New York, behind it. And then they have that first flag in front of it. So, and a lot of the damage is very similar on both of these flags, so we know they were just sewn together during the war because they didn't want to have to pick or choose between the two. And then Charles Rouse, who I mentioned from Company H, in his diary, and this is in 1863, so a little bit further down the timeline, but he wrote a roster for the color guard of the 11th. And that's something you don't see in the official paperwork of these regiments. But he decided, hey, I'm gonna record this. You know, this might be important. So he's on here. We have Sergeant Henry Eastman, and then we have his brother Irwin here, part of the color guard. We have Frank Metzger from Company I. So these were the guys up here actually doing the carrying of the colors in combat. And then these were the men that were, if something happened to these guys would drop their muskets and pick up the flag. All right, so the 11th Connecticut's going to leave New York for the seat of war, how they would have termed it. And after leaving New York City, they boarded 2 steamer vessels. So the left wing of the regiment was on one, the right was on the other. And while leaving to rendezvous in Annapolis, Maryland with Burnside, the 53rd New York, manning one of the forts outside of New York Harbor, they're going to fire on one of the ships. I think it was like a miscommunication or misidentification or something like that. So the ship is damaged, but there isn't any high casualties. I think there's like 1 guy wounded. And that ship turns around, they get on a new boat, and they head back down to Maryland. This isn't the one they were on, but this is what that ship probably would have looked like. So you could see it's not a very large ship. If there is like a berth deck under here, maybe some guys are down here, but a lot of the time the men are exposed up here on these upper decks here. So after meeting up in Maryland with Burnside's division and his expeditionary force, they're going to head down to North Carolina, and they're going to steam into Hatteras Inlet. Now this is January 1861, and the weather is pretty rough in Hatteras Inlet, and there's a rough time getting the Armada into Hatteras Inlet. And Charles Rouse writes about this in his diaries, but they steam down on January 7th, but they don't get off the boat until January 29th. They're almost on this boat for a month because both wings of the regiment run aground in the middle of Hatteras Inlet. And they're trying to get these other boats to come drag them out, but those boats also run aground. And so they're stuck on these boats for almost a month, and you can even read in his diaries, he's like, we've been stuck on this boat for 2 weeks now. And you can just feel the pain kind of coming through the words there, but they're holding it together. And eventually another boat picks up his wing of the regiment, and they drop him off at a little strip of land in the middle of Hatteras Inlet, closer to the shoreline. But they're going to miss the first battle in this campaign, the Battle of Roanoke Island. Their friends in the 8th Connecticut and the 10th Connecticut will fight there, but the 11th Connecticut is in kind of disrepair because the other wing of the regiment is still stuck out in the middle of Hatteras Inlet there. So they hang out on this island after a while, but this is an illustrated for the London News. So out in England, they do an illustration of what that would have looked like. You'd see the stormy weather, kind of rocking the boats around, guys running aground. And then this is an Alfred Wadge sketch of Union troops disembarking for the capture of the fort at Roanoke Island. So this is really what it would have looked like. You have these gunboats out there firing on the fort over here. And then I like to think these are guys in the 8th Connecticut. Probably not, but I like to think they are coming ashore here. So after Roanoke is captured, the regiment rejoins the division there, and the next battle is going to be the Battle of New Bern, North Carolina. And the whole objective here is, you can see this railroad that connects New Bern with the interior of the state of North Carolina. So they want to cut off the coastline from being resupplied. So Burnside is going to attack the town of New Bern, which is further down here, about 3 miles. And you can see here, the 11th Connecticut is in Park's brigade, John G. Park, with their sister regiment, the 8th Connecticut, and then they have a couple Rhode Island regiments, the 4th and 5th. During the approach to this, the Navy is actually going to drop off a bunch of artillery, and the 11th is going to be tasked, so they come back over here to pull these guns off the boats so the artillery can bombard the fort. There was a fort out here kind of denying access to the Union Armada there, so they had to bring some of their cannons ashore to fire effectively on the Confederate works up in here. So on November 14th, 1862, they're going to attack the works at New Bern, North Carolina. You have a great illustration here of the Union troops taking the works. That's John G. Park, their brigade commander, a colorized image of him. But there was a guy in Company A that wrote a great experience of this battle. His name is Philo A. Pierce from Company A. He was a New Fairfield guy. And he's going to be a reoccurring character in the rest of this presentation. But he wrote, "The troops suffered most coming up the road, but they soon filed off to the left and right, falling on their faces, and every chance they could get, give them a shot." Eventually, the 8th Connecticut is going to be the first regiment to hit the works there and get into the Confederate works. And the 11th won't be far behind them, along with the Rhode Islanders on their right. So the Confederates are overran, and they're going to fall back towards New Bern, which falls a few hours later. But even though this is a fairly dramatic account of the battle, we hear guys falling on their faces and stuff like that, the 11th Connecticut is going to suffer fairly light casualties. But unfortunately, that name I mentioned earlier, Edwin Lee of Company D, commanding Company D, he is going to be the first commissioned officer in the 11th Connecticut to be killed in action. His body was brought home, and he was buried with his family in Barkhamsted, Connecticut. A few months go by, and Colonel Thomas Kingsbury doesn't want to stick with the regiment anymore. He wants to go home and run for public office. He's got a battle under his belt, a victory nonetheless. And so he's going to go return home to run for public office. So we have this guy here, Henry W. Kingsbury. Now he's like a cousin of Thomas Kingsbury. I'm not sure if they ever actually met, but they're related nonetheless. But Kingsbury here, Henry Kingsbury, is a personal family friend of Ambrose E. Burnside. And his father died. Kingsbury's father dies in 1856, I believe, and Kingsbury kind of becomes like the non-biological father of Henry Kingsbury here. So July 12th, 1862, Henry Kingsbury is going to take command. He originally was he was the first lieutenant of the 5th United States Artillery, so the regular army. They served under the 5th Corps in the 1st Division during the Peninsula Campaign with McClellan in June of 1862. And yeah, so that's Henry Kingsbury. So after they leave North Carolina, they're going to steam up to Aquia Creek in Virginia, and they're going to change out of these uniforms, so the dress uniforms, and they're going to switch into something more like this uniform over here. We have a sack coat, or also termed a fatigue blouse. They kind of get rid of some of these McDowell-brimmed caps, and they go for more of either a rounded or square-edged one. And they also get, instead of dark blue trousers, they're also going to get light blue trousers. So something a little more standardized. Most of the Federal Army is wearing that kind of uniform at the time. But they switch out of these uniforms for something a little more appropriate for battlefield use. Now, joining the Maryland campaign, going up to the Battle of Antietam, there's going to be some reorganization. They're still in the 9th Corps under Burnside, but their division commander is a guy they're probably already familiar with, Colonel Isaac Rodman of the 4th Rhode Island Volunteers. And then they are in the 2nd Brigade, commanded by another familiar friend in the 8th Connecticut, Edward Harland here. So Harland's brigade would be organized with the 8th Connecticut, 11th Connecticut, now adding in a new regiment, the 16th Connecticut Volunteers, and they've only been in the Army for a couple weeks now. So they're not very experienced. They're even told at the Battle of South Mountain they're not going to fight, and the same at Antietam, but they do fight at Antietam. And then the 4th and 5th Rhode Island Volunteers are going to amalgamate into one regiment, just the 4th Rhode Island there. They're going to go down and fight at the Battle of South Mountain leading up to Antietam. That's after McClellan comes across one of Lee's special orders, 191, kind of telling McClellan, hey, we're going here now. And so they're going to chase Lee up South Mountain. And this is a sketch done by Joseph Joel of the 23rd Ohio. He was wounded at South Mountain, so this is his depiction of the battle at Fox's Gap, and that's where the 9th Corps is really going to make contact with the Confederates there. But Philip Pierce from Company A, he'll remember later on that we lay on the ground as soon as those guns opened fire. The 11th Connecticut was supporting artillery, so you look at like a cannon like this, they were behind this battery here, making sure nothing happened to them. But I think elements of the 11th Connecticut did make contact on South Mountain there. So they're laying flat on the ground as the guns opened up. There was a regular artillery engagement, and I can say the shells were cracking over us. At the foot of the mountain, we could see both ways from the flashes of the guns. And then it was slow work to push the Confederates up the mountain and out the other side. But then we could hear our men giving cheer after cheer, and we knew we had gained that day or night. So that's the Battle of South Mountain. A couple days later, between the 15th and 16th, McClellan's army is going to follow Lee up to the Antietam Creek and the town of Sharpsburg. And the 9th Corps is going to be on the southern end of the field there, kind of the leftmost flank of the Union Army. And Burnside and his guys, and specifically Rodman's division and Harlan's brigade, is going to be around this house here. This is the Henry Rohrback House. This is not too far away from the Rohrback Bridge, but we know that bridge now is Burnside's bridge, if you're familiar with Antietam. So 16th Connecticut, 8th, 11th, and the 4th Rhode Island are all going to be kind of hanging around in this area. And then on the 17th, per this really wonderful battlefield trust map, you can see the Rohrback House is right here. Burnside and his commander in this area, and then the Rohrback Bridge, or Burnside's bridge, is right here. The way Antietam works is that it's like the cornfield and the 1st Corps and those guys in the morning, 2nd Corps in the middle of the day, and then the 9th Corps kind of later in the afternoon. But the whole tactic around Burnside's bridge wasn't necessarily just to take the bridge, but it was to buy enough time and make enough of a distraction here at the bridge where the rest of Rodman's division can now come around the flank of Toombs Georgians here and come around his flank at Snavely's Ford. So the 11th Connecticut in the morning of the 17th, around 9-10 a.m., they're going to form up to go in. Philip Pierce wrote this really awesome description. I won't go through all of it, but this kind of sheds light on what the 11th Connecticut was doing. That's a photo of Philip Pierce there. He was like 18 years old around this time. So on the morning of the 17th, we ate our hardtack without any coffee and were soon called to order. We were on the move, getting the lines formed for the advance on the ridge above the creek. The rebel battery got a range on us. Soon our batteries were swung into position and the artillery duel commenced. While our colonel was getting us into line and was on his horse, a shell from the rebels broke and a piece struck his horse. As the horse fell, I had to dodge to keep it from falling on me. We were soon ordered forward. Companies A and B, as usual, were put on the skirmish line ahead of the battle line. So they actually were issued a faster rate of fire weapon called a Sharps rifle. It was a breech loader versus the regular muskets. And they were always ordered in front of the line, staggered at intervals to kind of kite the enemy there. Before we got to the creek, we came into a cornfield. In this cornfield, a rebel brass band who had run and left their horns and instruments lying on the ground. Now the fun commenced. Our Captain Griswold, commanding Company A, was a brave man and jumped over the fence, saying, "Come on, boys." I, with some others, did jump. As we did, we got a volley of shots from the rebel line. I fell into a ditch where it had been plowed and scraped. This surely saved my scalp. Now it was time to do our duty. Captain Griswold was hit and rushed into the creek and kept plunging ahead until he got across. He called for us to come and get him, but we had our hands full. I fired so fast that my rifle got hot and I had to pour water on it to cool it. Before our battle line got down, I had fired all my shells and what Sergeant Stevens had left. So this is the plaque on front of the 11th Connecticut Monument. You can see the regiment here along the farm lane here, and that's the same in this photo along this farm lane. That's the bridge down there. This is them firing up at the Georgians up on the heights here. You got the Burnside's Bridge, and then of course you have Captain Griswold storming across Antietam Creek trying to get his guys to go forward. This is not far from where the monument is on the battlefield. The monument's probably like over where the little red dot is, but this is where the 11th would have come across the field down to the bridge. And eventually that main line of the regiment comes down behind the skirmish line, shoulder to shoulder, and they're certainly going to pay for that in blood, unfortunately, for the 11th. Our loss was heavy. Though effectively a feint, this action was, it was a very costly one. Of the heavy losses, the 11th sustained about 250 men were killed or wounded. 37 of those were actually killed in action or mortally wounded. Captain John Griswold of Company A, this is him. He died of his wounds. He was pulled off the battlefield after the bridge was taken by the two 51st regiments, 51st New York and Pennsylvania. So he dies of his wounds later on. And then this is Private Alvin Flint. He was killed in action. And then this is Daniel Tarbox. And he was also, unfortunately, killed in action. A couple local guys to this area that were involved and unfortunately were killed in action. We have Corporal Oliver P. Ormsby, and he was a Franklin guy. He was 36 in Company H when he joined, but he was a sailor from Franklin. His name is not on the monument for whatever reason. We're not quite sure why he isn't on there, but maybe we got to talk to the Park Service about that. But you can see here, it's probably not too clear, but all of these guys right here are Company H individuals that were killed in action. So a lot of Company H guys, unfortunately, a bunch of Company D and Company E guys. And those would have been the guys in the main line, not necessarily the skirmish line. And another man who lost his life at Antietam from Ledyard was Samuel Rogers. And his name is on that monument right outside here to the memorial to the Civil War soldiers. He was also in Company H, but he was buried on the battlefield. His body was not returned home like his comrade Ormsby, and he is still buried at Antietam. He was reinterred on the National Cemetery. And among those casualties is going to be the new Henry W. Kingsbury. And my friend Matt here found a really great letter from Captain Converse. He's from Windsor Locks, but he was with Kingsbury during this entire thing. So Kingsbury, during the height of the attack, had been with Captain James Pierpont of Company E when the attack was at its height. Pierpont alerted to Captain Converse that Kingsbury had been wounded in both feet, so they're trying to get him off the field. As they're bringing him off the field towards relative safety, he's hit in the shoulder again, splintering the bone. So the men are picking him up, they're bringing him off the field, and then it's not those three wounds that are going to do him in. It's the fourth wound he receives being carried off. He's hit in the side, and that's going to be the mortal wound that can't be treated. So they're going to try and get him comfortable. They bring him to a tree line about probably where the monument is today on the battlefield. And Converse is talking to Kingsbury. Kingsbury was saying, like, get my sword belt off. And during the attack, Kingsbury had been holding his pistol. And he had probably tucked it into his belt at some point because Converse remembered in this letter that he took the belt off and the pistol came tumbling down. At this time, the men are going to bring him up to the Rohrback house, and they're going to try to bring him inside to be treated, but he's going to refuse to go inside. So they bring a large lounge or like a sofa out for Kingsbury to lay on. And this is where Kingsbury is going to dictate to Captain Converse how he wants his effects handled and to write a letter to his mother and his wife that he said goodbye. At this time, he closes his eyes. He remains conscious, though, while Dr. Whitfield of the 31st Ohio is going to work on him and at least get him comfortable. And later that evening, his good friend and mentor and even non-biological father, Ambrose E. Burnside, is going to come, tears in his eyes, to say goodbye to his friend. Kingsbury lingers until the next morning on the 18th, but he dies of his wounds that morning at 25 years old. So very young guy, but a very promising career for this man. I think he would have probably been a division commander if he had lived long enough, but unfortunately he died of his wounds at Antietam. So after Antietam, the regiment is going to lick their wounds. McClellan is going to make his headquarters at Pleasant Valley, Maryland. They're going to hang out there for a while. But Griffin A. Stedman, he's going to become the colonel of the regiment at this point. And under him, Converse is going to be made the major. And then Lieutenant Colonel Mogling is going to move up in ranks to one of those staff positions there. Harlan's brigade at this point is going to be bolstered with the 15th and 21st Connecticut Volunteers. And then in November 5th, 1862, Burnside is going to come in command of the Army. And that brings us to the Battle of Fredericksburg. So if you're familiar with the Civil War, you probably know about Marye's Heights and the desperate yet futile attacks that the Union are going to launch at the entrenched Confederates at the Stone Wall. They're going to suffer very high casualties. And then even the same thing on the other end of the battlefield, high casualties, and what a lot of people back home viewed as a useless battle. It didn't really do much for the Union Army. The 9th Corps, though, in this battle isn't going to really participate in a lot of this principal fighting. And the 11th is really going to make up the left flank pickets during this battle. During the fighting on the 13th, the last day of the battle, they're going to be laying on their arms, and Harlan's brigade suffers very light casualties, mainly from overshot Confederate artillery, and their losses were around 40 men versus the whole regimental losses of Antietam was 250. Now a whole brigade is not suffering as many casualties. That winter, they make winter quarters at Stafford Heights, and that's around on the other side of the Rappahannock River in Stafford, Virginia. And this is actually a recent monument that was put up to where the camp for Harlan's brigade was. You can't really see it too well, but they have like the 15th Connecticut along Route 218, the 4th Rhode Island, and then they have a bunch of Connecticut units. So I think the 11th was probably somewhere in here or over here. But that whole area now is a town and country plaza. So go visit the monument, and then you can hit like a CVS or a Stop and Shop or something like that. But this is where they're going to make their winter quarters between 1862 and 63. And their camp would have looked a lot like this. This is a print of the 20th Connecticut around the same time frame, but you have these company streets, very neatly made, with these nice log huts for the Civil War, for the soldiers. And this is what one of those really cabins, but log huts would have looked like. So you got a little chimney here, you got some bunks, and then they use their tents as the actual roofs. But pretty warm and good for these guys for the winter. In the spring, as the snow melts away, in the spring of 1863, this division of the 9th Corps, now under Getty, Rodman had perished at Antietam, so it's now under George Getty, and he would have brought this division of the 9th Corps, where the 11th is stationed, down to Suffolk, Virginia. And they're going to participate in the Siege of Suffolk. And effectively what this is it's Longstreet during the Chancellorsville campaign. So Confederate General Longstreet's going to bring his corps down to Suffolk to clear out the Yankees in this area. But also this area of Virginia had been relatively untouched by the war. So they're going to gather supplies in this area. They're going to forage, get food, tack, stuff like that, to bring back to Lee's army. So they're going to besiege the town of Suffolk for about a month between like early April, early May of 1863. And it's a very well-defended town because there's like 8 or 9 well-built Union batteries and forts surrounding the area, and the Confederates just can't get in. So what they end up doing is, along the Nansemond River, they build their own batteries to stop the Union supply boats and stuff from reinforcing the Union garrison there. This is George Getty's headquarters at Suffolk. You can see May 1863. They have a little ball field over here. They have like a picket line here, musket stack, and this is probably Getty's tent right here. And one of the principal actions here is Hill's Point. And the 11th Connecticut doesn't take part in this particular action, but their friends in the 8th Connecticut do. So Charles Rouse writes, the pickets have come in, orders to march, orders countermanded. About sunset, the gunboats commenced shelling the woods, and the 8th Connecticut and 89th New York made a charge on a rebel battery that had been planted to obstruct the passage of the boats and captured the entire battery with 129 prisoners. The firing continued through the night. As the siege is going on, though, they're doing regular soldier things. They're drilling, they're doing fatigue duty. So while there was a present threat to the Union garrison there, not that they weren't taking it seriously, but they found enough time to maintain themselves as soldiers. This siege is going to break on May 4th, 1863. Lee is going to call Longstreet back to the Army of Northern Virginia, and the 11th Connecticut, along with their division, is now going to be under the command of General John Dix. And they go up to the peninsula where the Chickahominy River is, the Williamsburg and Yorktown, and they're going to do a lot of reconnaissance work in that area. And this is around the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg. So John Dix is ordered to go try and take Richmond, or at least cut off the supply lines for Lee around Richmond, but this campaign is going to fall apart, and that's why we don't really hear about it. And then that's going to bring us to the end of 1863. October 1st, 1863, the 11th returns to Gloucester Point, Virginia, and around the area of Fortress Monroe. So this is Fort Monroe right here. And now the Army has been in for almost 3 years now. Enlistments are going to start running out. And the men of the 11th, who originally were at 987 officers and men, when the men re-enlist, they're now at 276. But they're promised a 30-day furlough to return home for a little while. And then when they come back, they've done a little bit of recruiting, but they get up to just around 300. So they've suffered some nasty casualties, especially at Antietam. But they had originally, again, they started off with 987. That's pretty much a full regiment, and now they're a fraction of that size. And that's due to battle, disease, and a number of other issues. That brings us to the spring of 1864, and they are going to be sent to the 18th Corps. That's their corps badge right here. They were part of the Army of the James, commanded by Benjamin Butler here. And then their corps commander, Baldy Smith, is right here. And they're in Martindale's division. But now their brigade commander is no other than their own colonel, Griffin A. Stedman. They are no longer with their friends in the 8th Connecticut or the 16th Connecticut anymore. They are reorganized, and the 8th Connecticut is still in the 18th Corps, just not the same division anymore. And these guys are going to participate in the Bermuda 100 campaign south of Richmond, while Grant and Lee are starting to make their way down with battles like the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. So I made this little map here. This is where Grant and his forces are or Grant and Meade and the Army of the Potomac are up at Culpeper County, Virginia. This first X here, that's the Wilderness. That's Spotsylvania Courthouse right here. And around that same time, the Army of the James is going to come out from Fort Monroe over here, sail past Newport News, up the James River, and they're going to make contact at Port Walthall Junction. Say that 5 times fast, Port Walthall. And the whole purpose of this is to cut the supply lines between Petersburg, Virginia, and Richmond. So they're trying to kind of put pressure on Richmond from 2 different sides. At the same time, way out west, you have Uncle Billy's boys, William Tecumseh Sherman, starting to make their way through Georgia with the siege of Atlanta and all of that. So a lot of pressure being put on the Confederacy at this time. So the Bermuda 100 campaign, Port Walthall and Swift Creek, they're making works along the Bermuda 100 front here. The 11th Connecticut, I think, is around this area here. But they're going to engage Bushrod Johnson's Confederates at Port Walthall. They're going to stop a major or a relatively large Confederate attack there. But Smith is not going to, or not Smith, Benjamin Butler is not going to capitalize on this victory because he really wants support from the Union gunboats because he doesn't have a whole lot of artillery that he can use. So he's relying on the Navy a lot through this. Confederates are going to retreat to Swift Creek, which is either between 10 and 12 miles, depending on the route you take, to the west. And they are going to engage Confederates there around the Arrowfield Church. It's a Union victory again at that battle, but again is not capitalized by Butler due to the lack of artillery support from the gunboats. So after that, on May 16th, they're going to march north up here to Fort Darling. And this battle has a few different names. We call it Drury's Bluff, but it's also known as Proctor's Creek, also known as the Battle of Fort Darling. And the veterans remembered it as the Battle in the Fog. On the morning of the 16th, a successful attack from the Union troops are going to carry these forward trenches here, but they're going to stay there. They're not going to, again, capitalize on that victory. And eventually, there's a large fog that descends upon the battlefield on that morning, and the Confederates are going to come right around the right flank during this battle and kind of not swallow up the army, but toss them out. Philo Pierce said that Uncle Homer and one of the other men in Company A, he's actually the oldest man in the company. He's 51 when he enlisted, but so all the men in his company called him Uncle Homer. So Uncle Homer and I laid together under our blankets. In the morning, he shook me and said, "Get up." He made a little fire and made some coffee, but we had hardly eaten our hardtack and drunk our coffee when our pickets in front began firing. It was a foggy morning, and we couldn't see far ahead, about 15 rods. That's about 250 feet. And now there are a couple different attacks on this line that the 11th beat back, but then the Confederates sweep around the right flank, and Colonel Stedman is trying to keep the men in line. Don't break, hold the line at all hazards, but eventually that line will break. They're using bayonets in this. Philo Pierce even remembers a rebel colonel swinging a sword at his head, but they take him down not long after. That line is going to break, and they even heard their general and Colonel Stedman saying, "Run," and "No, I did," and all the rest, Pierce remembered. This isn't a wartime image. This is an AI-generated image. We don't have a lot of photos of Drury's Bluff, but this captures kind of the essence of what that battle would have looked like, very foggy and confusing. On the retreat out of Drury's Bluff, about 170 men from the 11th are going to be captured, sent to Andersonville or Florence prison camps. Then that brings them to Cold Harbor. They are going to get there on June 1st and take part in a little bit of fighting, mainly skirmishing, but they're going to come up the right flank of the Army of the Potomac. And this last little chunk of Union troops here, that's Stedman's brigade. And on the morning of the 3rd, Pierce recalled, we were in front on a grand bayonet charge early in the morning. Here I will say it was great slaughter on our side. Philip Pierce remembers being slightly wounded in this, and he fell into a Confederate rifle pit. And with 2 other wounded men, he said, I dug our hole deeper by laying on my back and scooping the dust out with my tin cup. This battle was pretty bad for the 11th Connecticut. They suffered some 91 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. And among those was the officer who comforted Kingsbury kind of in his dying moments, Joseph Converse. So he did not survive the war, unfortunately. After Cold Harbor, they're going to return to Bermuda 100. That's right up here. And then they're going to be ordered to start the operation towards the siege of Petersburg. So the 18th Corps is going to follow this line, more or less, to this line right here. And this is the Confederate battle line. We have a few different Confederate batteries. The 18th Corps is going to get there first. And Baldy Smith, commanding the Corps, he wants to attack. He gets there earlier in the day, but he doesn't have any support. He's waiting for Hancock the Superb from the famed 2nd Corps to show up to help him out, but they don't show up until about dark. So Smith has to make a decision here, and he orders an attack around 7 p.m. where they capture 3 rebel batteries, but they aren't able to capitalize on that because they don't have any support. During this battle, this is a depiction of the 18th Corps attacking battery number 5, which we saw on the landmark on the map there. And the men in this account here, I don't have enough time to read the whole thing, but they're going to get into some of these early works around the battery. But they end up, a Confederate countercharge comes in and they get surrounded. Some of the men are going to be able to escape, but a number of the men are captured. And that's around the time that Hancock shows up to support the 18th Corps, but now it's too late. It's dark. They can't get in there, so they can't make another attack. So Petersburg won't fall for another 291 days. And this is going to kick off the siege of Petersburg that we know with the famed mine explosion and all that. But through the months of July and August, as that siege continues, the 11th Connecticut is going to be in the frontline trenches through most of this. This is an Alfred Wadd sketch of the 18th Corps artillery firing at Confederates from around this time frame. But that man I just mentioned, Homer Barnum, the oldest man in Company A, he's 54 during the siege of Petersburg. And he was a very stubborn man, but while they're interacting with Confederate sharpshooters, there's a particularly nasty gunfight. And Philip Pierce was telling Uncle Homer, this is Uncle Homer here, telling Uncle Homer, hey, get down, you're going to get shot. And Uncle Homer turns to Philip Pierce and to the effect says, mind your own business. And Homer Barnum is shot through the head and he's killed. In the same company, his son, Eben Barnum, is their corporal. So unfortunately, Pierce had to go tell Eben that his father had been killed in combat. Again, Barnum was 54 years old at the time of his death. Around the same time frame, another colonel of the 11th Connecticut is struck down. We were just talking a little bit about some of those tunneling operations. They don't do another large mine explosion, but there is infantry trying to tunnel their way through no man's land so they can jump off and attack without sustaining as many casualties. So on a surprise kind of attack on August 5th, Griffin Stedman here is talking to their corps commander, and this attack breaks out, bullets are flying everywhere, and one is going to meet him in the stomach. And He's going to be brought to a field hospital where he is made on the spot a brigadier general. He's no longer just a colonel anymore. So they bury him as General Stedman. This seems to have affected the men very much. This is the guy that led them from Antietam all the way to Petersburg, and the men very much loved him. So they were pretty sad when he passed away. Even among the staff, they name Fort Stedman at the Petersburg line after Griffin Stedman. He was returned to Hartford, and this is his grave right here. Has a wonderfully carved flag. It's a reproduction of one of their flags with all the battle honors on it. Even have his hat and his sword carved on there. At the around fall of 1864, there's going to be a Medal of Honor recipient, or a man who earns the Medal of Honor, Captain Samuel Horne. He's an Irish immigrant who settled in Winchester, Connecticut, and he was serving as captain of Company H, that Norwich area company, but he was attached to the command staff of O.C. Ord, one of the 18th Corps commanders. I think he was 18th Corps commander at this time. And at the Battle of Fort Harrison, Captain Horne was relaying a message from one of the brigade commanders back to Ord when he was severely wounded and his horse was killed out from under him. And even though he was severely wounded, he still relayed that message back to Ord before he received medical treatment. So in 1897, well after the Civil War, under President McKinley's administration, McKinley was also a Civil War veteran and a Medal of Honor recipient, Horne was given the Medal of Honor. So that's a picture of him in the 1890s. Fall of 64, command of the 11th falls under Randall H. Rice, and they're doing a lot of interaction with sharpshooters and rebel artillery. This is another 18th Corps artillery sketch here. And it's not until around the end of 1864 that they're reorganized into the 24th Corps under the famed General John Gibbon. Early spring 1865, they're going to finally get a new set of flags. So those flags we saw at the beginning of the presentation do not get replaced until almost the end of the war. And these are a gift from General Stedman's wife, Julia Beach. This is their new national flag, has all their battle honors on it from New Bern down to Petersburg. And then this is their new regimental embroidered flag, not a painted flag anymore, but it has some of their battle honors on there as well. Major Charles Warren said, "May God help us defend it and bear it through any scenes we may be called to pass, until its colors wave over a united, peaceful, and happy country." April 1865, I know that says 64, typo. April 1865, the siege of Petersburg is broken, and the Confederates are going to flee the Richmond area, and the first troops to enter the city of Richmond is the black troops of the 29th Connecticut. But not long behind them is going to be the 11th Connecticut. And after the armistice is signed, the 11th Connecticut is going to spend a lot of time in the Richmond area because their re-enlistments are not up yet. And so it's not until December of 1861 that the 11th Connecticut, or not 1861, December 1865, the 11th Connecticut finally returns to Connecticut. They're in Richmond so long, they even see Sherman's men march from the North Carolina area through Richmond to Washington. So they were down there for quite a long time. They even petitioned the governor to let them come home. And so then they're brought home in December. So through their time, the 11th Connecticut Regiment of Volunteers has served in 10 principal engagements, not including any of those smaller ones we might have touched on. And through their time, they suffered killed in action 92 men, wounded, including mortally, 372. 155 men of the 11th were captured, died in prison, 15, and discharged for disability, 307. Now, this isn't all of their casualty figures, but including all the other ones that might not be present here, the 11th Connecticut suffered 1,126 casualties throughout the war. All right, and that does it for my presentation here. So thank you for coming. If you have any questions about the museum, New England Civil War Museum, please visit us online at newenglandcivilwarmuseum.com. And if you have any questions about the battle flag collection, I put my email on here. So I would love to answer any questions about the regiment or the flags or anything like that. But that will do it for my presentation. So thank you.